We've just got back from our holidays to the Outer Hebrides in Scotland, also known as the Western Isles, and we were intrigued by just how cheap the ferry was to get there. Now, before going, we were looking at ferry crossings to France, which were way more expensive. To be clear, on the Scottish ferries, we got 4 ferry crossings for £211, whereas the French Channel crossings for the same dates were at least £560 in our camper van. So a huge saving. But is there a catch? Let's have a look now. The ferry line Caledonia-Muckbrain, or CalMac, is in part owned by the Scottish Government, and therefore it is subsidised to some extent, and it keeps the rates cheaper. Now, this is partly because the Scottish Government is invested in keeping the island life going and people living on the islands, because it's good for the economy, it keeps that culture alive, and it makes it possible for people to stay there. But also the benefit for us as tourists going there is that it keeps rates down. Out on the islands themselves, the terminals between islands were way smaller again and even more relaxed, with the ferry between Sout Uist and the Isle of Skye offering chemical waste disposal, which was really handy for campers as well. But strangely for me, the ferry port Castle Bay on Barra and Tarbert on Harris, which had connections with some of the bigger ferries to the mainland, actually had fewer facilities that were open all hours. In fact, the toilets closed, I think, at 5 p.m. You couldn't just get there late and go to the toilet easily. It was just a bit more of a hassle, which I found quite surprising, but it's something to note. In terms of when you're at the ferry, despite having strict timings and cut-offs on your tickets, check-in times and so on, it didn't feel like they were really worried about that with people working at the ferry, and they didn't start boarding on our first journey until even after cut-off time because there was a delay at the ferry port. So we were getting there well ahead of schedule, about an hour and a half, but actually we didn't leave until 45 minutes after the allocated time anyway. Although I'd always recommend getting there early, it still has much more of a chilled out feel than a channel crossing if you're going England to France, say. Now, when you receive your tickets for Caledonia-Muckbrain ferries, there's no need to print your ticket, because when you're at the ferry you can use the QR code. You can take the ticket hard copy if you wish as a backup, but they really just want the QR code. So if you're happy using it on the phone, take it and just have it ready to show them, and that will be absolutely fine, as it was what we did. Now, the ferry we travelled on from Oban to Barra, so from the mainland to the first island, was called the MV Isle of Lewis, and it was well appointed, but not quite as well appointed as the bigger channel ferries that you might expect. Again, if you're used to going, say, from England to France or any other channel crossings to other countries. Now, on board the ferry, there was a lot of comfy seating. I was surprised by that, and even some space to spread out and lounge a little bit. And we went back in June. Now, in summer holidays might be a different story, but even so, we had a lot of space. I even could spread out and just curl around in one of these big booths they had, which was really nice. An added bonus of the trip, and it wasn't like everyone was fighting for seats. It was so much better than that. There were also areas that had more like airline seating, and you could sit upright in those, and they were still comfortable. I did try them out. There was also an area for pets. Now, if you take your dog on board, you had to sit in a certain area which had, again, this kind of airline seating, but they were restricted to certain areas. Still, they were still comfy. We actually sat in that area initially without realizing it, and we moved on later, but there was space for the pets. The dogs all seemed calm. There weren't any dogs going crazy on board or anything like that. So it seemed fine for if you've got pets. We don't, but just so you know, there is a pet seating area and the seats were still comfy. There was also cafe restaurants on the bigger ferries from the mainland to the islands, and they started serving food quite quickly after leaving, actually. And it's the usual kind of affair you'd expect on British food. You know, obviously you got your fish and chips, your sausage, beans and chips, but then they had soups and then sandwiches, hot sandwiches, some salads, and it was actually pretty good. I went and had a meal on the trip from Oban to Barra, and it was in the range of $14.95 for fish and chips, which is a little bit pricey, I'll admit, but it was really good. It was cooked to order at that point as well, so it was really tasty, but just a little bit on the pricey side, as you'd imagine from these kind of journeys, because obviously the prices go up. There was also a bar and cafe area at the other end of the ship serving more teas, coffees and alcoholic drinks. I didn't buy much from there because I was driving, and we also took tea in our thermos flask trying to save money, so that side of it. But it's still, if you want to do that, you had that option at the one end. Now, as far as going out on deck on these boats, you could go out on deck on the front and rear decks, say on the bigger ferries, on all of them, but I'd say especially when you're going from the mainland to the islands or vice versa, it gets so windy that you've got to be careful out there. In fact, I even felt a little bit unsafe, a little bit scared at one point going on the upper deck on one of the windier crossings, and I was holding onto the handrail, and I still didn't feel safe between the slippery surface on the floor and the extreme wind. There was nobody out there at this point, and that was why. But it's not the kind of thing that you're just going to have a really relaxed, scenic view most of the time. Of course, it's Scottish weather. Look, I'm from Wales. I know how this weather can be. It is as you'd expect. So if you are going looking for wildlife or want to be spending your time looking at the scenery on deck, I would recommend taking waterproof trousers and even maybe gloves in summer, because the wind got so cold it was hard to take photos and video even without gloves, because that was an icy feel to the wind even in mid-June for us. And to add on to that point about the deck, I wouldn't advise letting children, if you're taking children, to go out on the deck on their own, because like I said, I felt unsafe at points. Children could be slipping and sliding. The wind will blow them over for sure. It's not the kind of place you want to let them run freely on a windy day, at least. I remember again going on holidays from the south coast of England to France, and the ferries never felt that unsafe. And it's partly the design, but also the size of the boat that just makes you feel things that much more. These Scottish ferries, you really get the full brunt of the weather. And that leads me into our next point about the weather. Now, when you're leaving, let's say, Oban, the mainland, and you're going out, you get this beautiful scenery. You feel the wind on your face, but the calm waters, because you're going between, in our case, we're next to the Isle of Mull. The scenery is absolutely stunning. But it can lull you into a false sense of security, because as soon as you get past the islands and out into the open water, the bump and the chop of the open sea really starts to hit. It's not that the boat is just, bouncing like you might worry about. It's not that bad, but it really does step up a notch as soon as you come into that open water. And on that front, I was told beforehand to have a meal early on in the journey to prevent seasickness. Now, foolishly, I didn't take that advice from my uncle. I hope he's not watching this. I ended up going to have my fish and chips late on into the journey to try and cure it, which it did. But if you are at all concerned about seasickness, I'd recommend having a full meal as early on in the journey as you can, perhaps even before you get on. It should help. Just remember that journey is going to be totally different when you're out in that open water compared to those calmer inlets on the start from the mainland. And also, being on a smaller boat, there were a few bangs that you would hear on the hull as you went. Now, it's nothing dangerous, nothing to worry about, but it does give you a little bit of a shock the first few times you hear it, kind of like feeling turbulence on a plane. So if you are a bit worried about it, just be prepared for that. Don't worry about it. It's completely safe. It's not like you feel like you're going to capsize or anything, but you do hear these sounds and knocks and bangs. But again, there's not really much to worry about. 99.9% of the time, absolutely fine. Now, coming back to the facilities on board the boat, one thing I was surprised not to see actually was any shops. Although they had the cafe and the restaurant, they didn't really sell much in the way of souvenirs and guidebooks and things like that, which I was expecting they would. Now, like on a Channel ferry, you'd have duty free. My lasting memory is of all the bottles clinking as the boat starts moving. Obviously, there's no duty free because you're not going between countries, but also there really wasn't anywhere to buy souvenirs, which I was a bit surprised about. They did, however, have a tourist information type kiosk, and the people there were great. They gave me a nice free map of the Hebrides, which I used throughout our trip, but it just wasn't that same vibe. So you can't really go shopping on board, which I thought you might have the option to do. I'd also say that the two bigger ferries we travelled on from the mainland to the islands and back were actually really comfortable and really relaxed for the size of the ferry. Again, there was much more comfortable seating than I remember from Channel ferry crossings. Just felt that much more chilled out in the whole. Another point is to note is that the toilets on board, they were pretty good, although when I went into the first one, the soap dispenser wasn't working, and so I had to go into another toilet to wash my hands properly, and you've got to open and close lots of doors. So if you do go in, check the soap dispenser first. I also found a shower on the journey from the Isle of Harris back to the mainland, or back to the Isle of Skye, Uig on Skye, and that was a really welcome addition to the journey. So there are showers on some of the boats, but I didn't see them on the way out from Oban to Barra, for instance. Now, another point to add is that I've talked a lot about the bigger ferries between the mainland and the islands, or vice versa, but when the inter-island ferries are actually so much smaller, so do be aware of that. For instance, when we got the ferry from Barra over to Outer Skye just below Sout Uist. I think the crossing's maybe only 45 minutes. The ferry itself is tiny and you can stay in the car the whole time if you want. There's only a decking area. The only indoor area that I remember was the toilet, and there's a few seats. It might carry 20 cars or so. It's such a complete change. So between the different islands, you've got generally much smaller ferries. The bigger the ferry, the longer the journey time, or the shorter the journey time, the smaller the ferry. So you can be prepared, but at least you don't really need those same facilities when you're on a shorter journey. Also, the ferry terminals reflect that as well, in the sense that the smaller ones are really relaxed. You can just pretty much rock up on time and not have to worry about it because they're so small. But again, I would always recommend getting there on time. The vibe is just so different to any other ferry terminals I've ever been to. So even though these ferries are very cheap, they're actually still very good quality on the longer journeys, and you get a lot out of them. So don't be afraid. Don't worry too much about what it's going to be like, and try and enjoy your time aboard. We had a great time in Scotland, but yes, take winter clothes even in summer, lots of waterproofs, and you'll be ready to go. I hope you found this useful, and check out my next video for more tips, and I'll see you then.